Do Disney characters influence our perception of beauty? From the bold, symmetrical features of heroes to the exaggerated, sharp lines of villains. Let's explore how these visual cues define the roles that we love to love and love to hate. Let's start with hair, and let's see how Disney separates out the heroes from the villains. When we look at the heroes, we can see that they usually are portrayed with a low hairline. For the female characters, the shape can either be rounded, such as in the case of Moana, or more M-shaped, as we see with Belle. For men, they tend to have strong temples, such as in the case of Hercules, Prince Philip, and Hans. And when it comes to hair color, for the heroes, it's usually red, blonde, or brown. But for villains, Disney paints an entirely different picture. For example, their hair tends to not even be visible, like we can see with the Evil Queen, or Maleficent, or Jafar. And when it comes to hair color, it tends to be white, such as in the case of Ursula or Cruella de Vil. Or the hair color can be blue, such as in the case of Hades. And the hairstyle is usually a bit more spiky. Now for the villains, even when their hair is covered up, you can usually see that whatever they're wearing on their head, like a hat, is usually quite spiky and has this type of very angular, pointy projection that's going up into different directions. Now let's talk about eyebrows and how they look different between the heroes and the villains. For women, the eyebrows tend to be high, thin, and straight, such as in the case of Cinderella, or they can be straight and a bit thicker like we see in Moana's case. For men, the eyebrows are also placed in a high position. They're usually quite straight and thick, such as in the case of Flynn Rider. And what we see in most of these heroes is that the tail of the brow is usually the lowest point. That tends to give them a friendlier type of appearance. But for the villains, it's usually a very different type of representation. We can see, for example, the Evil Queen had quite exaggerated arches to her brows. And there are other villains with the similar type of eyebrow configuration. And some even have low, thin, flat eyebrows like Hades. And now let's talk about the eyes. When we look at the heroes, we see a certain set of traits related to their eyes. This includes supratarsal show, moderate length eyelashes, a smooth lower lid to cheek transition, and limited makeup around the eyes. Instead, for the villains, we see a very different set of features, and that includes absent or extra long eyelashes, extravagant eyeshadow, high supratarsal crease, supraorbital hollowing, ptosis, forehead and glabellar wrinkles. And when we look at the shape of the eyes, with the heroes, they tend to be more almond shaped. Yet with the villains, the eyes are usually much more open and round, or they tend to be a lot more narrow and closed off. Take a look at how adding that color around the eyes can really bring out a certain type of look here for the villains. So when we look at the Evil Queen, we can see that darkened type of almost like grayish, greenish type of hue around the entire eye that brings out a certain type of look, right? She looks a little bit older. She looks a little bit crazier with that coloration. When we look at Maleficent, we see that purple type of eyeshadow, and it's extending all the way to the eyebrow itself, and that also is matching with her dress, and that's giving a certain type of vibe. Now look at Jafar, and you can also see that discoloration, that darker type of hue around the eyes, that again is making him look a little bit older, a little bit more mean. And Ursula also has that darker type of eyeshadow, and she has a blue type of color on her upper eyelid and also extending to the lower eyelid. Cruella was outfitted with a green type of eyeshadow, and that again works with her green earrings there, and just gives off maybe a slightly less friendly type of appearance. And Hades has that darker blue right there at the lower eyelid, almost imitating some infraorbital hollowing, if you will, and again makes him just look maybe a little bit less friendly and a little bit more villainous. Just like the heroes and the villains who embrace their own unique traits, true beauty is about feeling confident with who you are. And that's why my brand Feel Confident exists, to help you embrace your natural beauty no matter what your goals are. So check out our premium quality skincare and hair care products at feelconfident.com. Thanks so much for your support. Oh, and use FC10 for 10% off your first order. Now let's look at how the nose differs between the heroes and the villains. For the female heroes, we tend to see the following traits: a low to absent nasal bridge, a pointy nasal tip with limited bulbosity, or a slightly wider tip. In men, we see that the bridge of the nose tends to be straight, and there could be some slight convexity. The tip is usually rather narrow and pointy, and the nasal tip usually has minimal bulbosity. Also, for both men and women, the nasolabial angle tends to be at least 90 degrees, if not more. So essentially, we rarely see that the nasal tip is droopy. It's usually fairly flat or raised. For the villains, we see a very different type of nasal anatomy. We usually see some dorsal convexity or a bump on the bridge of the nose. We can also sometimes see some growths on the nasal skin. The nasal tip also tends to be droopy with at least a moderate degree of nasal tip bulbosity. And the ala, which are the wings of the nose, usually have thick skin associated with them. And sometimes we see that the nasal tip can be severely over-rotated, or the nasal bridge can appear ultra narrow. Now, how about the lips of these Disney characters? Well, the heroes usually have about an equal upper to lower lip ratio, or the lower lip is slightly larger than the upper. The lips tend to be quite symmetrical with very natural curves, and the Cupid's bow is usually well defined. But when it comes to the lips of villains, they're usually quite thin. The lips also tend to be quite boxy without those natural curves, and the corners are usually very downturned. Now with the villains, it's not just how their lips look in a static type of way, it's also when they're dynamically moving the lips, there's a lot more emotion there, and the expressions are a lot more exaggerated, whether they're frowning or smiling in a very kind of a large way, right? You can see the teeth more, you can see just a lot more emotion in their faces, and it's usually making them look a bit more crazed or sinister. Now let's look at the cheeks of these Disney characters. For the heroes, the cheeks are usually rounded, and sometimes the cheeks can be prominent, but usually there's not a whole lot of emphasis that's put on bringing more attention to the cheek area. Contrast that with the villains, where we often see these pointy type of cheeks. They're usually very pronounced, and it brings some of our attention to that area specifically. Also, we often see this infra-cheek hollowing that some people in real life can get with buccal fat removal. And now let's take a quick look at their ears. For the heroes, the women tend to have hidden ears or partially hidden ears, where you might see the lobule or part of the lobule, but not the entire ear. And the men tend to have a rounded type of ear structure with appropriate sizing. Remember that the size of the ear is usually fairly equal to the length of one's nose. And those are usually the types of measurements that we're seeing with these male heroes. With the villains, we sometimes don't see the ears at all. And other times when they are visible, they're usually quite small and pointy, almost closer to an elf-like appearance. Strangely enough, there is a cosmetic type of procedure where some people actually want to create an elf type of ear, believe it or not. It's not the most commonly requested procedure, but it does exist, and it's a little bit more in the realm of body modification procedures, not in the classic cosmetic surgery realm. Now let's look at the jaw structures of these Disney characters. The heroes usually have a rounded, defined type of jaw structure. They have strong, prominent jaws, and usually there's little to no submental fullness. So you see an acute submental angle with hyoid bones that tend to be higher and more posterior. On the other hand, the villains usually have these pointy chins, and they usually have less definition to their jawlines with some degree of submental fullness. So I think what we have here is like a chicken or the egg phenomenon. Is it that Disney is representing with these heroes and villains how people actually are, and taking, the best looking traits for the heroes and different traits that might indicate a less friendly type of person to be a villain? Or is it that Disney is actually setting the standard and then we're adjusting or adapting to what we're supposed to think is attractive and what we think is a friendlier type of appearance or a less friendly appearance based on what we see in our early years on TV? If we were instead exposed to all types of looks that could be either a hero or a villain without these predictable patterns, would we then see the world a little bit differently? Would we care as much about aging and how we start to look different as we get older, or how some people are born with just slightly different features? I do wonder that sometimes. So I want to know what you guys think. Do you think that Disney is setting the stage here for how we should perceive ourselves and the world around us? Or are they just representing what already exists and not really doing anything too different from how we already see each other and experience ourselves and others, and how we see beauty in the world around us? Let me know what you guys think in the comments below, but I think it's a very interesting topic because, Disney is everywhere. And I think they have a lot of influence on all of us from a very early age. And do you think that we should see more heroes with droopy nasal tips and eyebrows that are not as elevated, and, chins that are a little bit pointier, and, maybe having a little bit more fullness under the chin? Could that still be a hero? Or will that character not be perceived as a hero? Or, will Disney not be able to sell as many, Disney Plus subscriptions? Or will that affect their bottom line if they start to change, who's a classic type of hero? What face is classically a hero versus one that is destined to be more of a villain? Can we flip the script and still get people watching these movies? I don't know. Well, that'd be an interesting experiment. These iconic Disney characters don't just entertain. They shape our ideas of beauty, often influencing the standards that we see in real life. So the next time that you watch a Disney movie, think about how these characters might be influencing your own views on beauty and those of your kids.